I haven't spoken to a center audience since 1988, probably, and it must have been about, I don't know, Harappan artifacts. And so this is a good chance to say thank you to the center and to the South Asian community here who basically launched this 20-year-long adventure. And to Mark Canoyer in particular, who's not here, but he deserves all thanks in the world and gave me my first glimpse of South Asia and India. So I strongly recommend incorporating undergraduates in your research whenever possible, because you never know what's going to happen. So the story I'm going to tell, and also thanks to the Human Rights Working Group, the Environmental Working Group of the Human Rights Initiative, that's a non-funded initiative, who is co-sponsoring here. So there is a little bit of a human rights angle. You're going to see a lot more frogs than human rights. The workers' rights question is, we discovered quite empirically, quite by accident, and quite urgently while we were blundering around counting frogs. So what you're going to see is interdisciplinary and still at an early stage of the game. If you go to the Western Ghats and you make your way through the foliage there, you find yourself in heavily forested environment. That's not entirely surprising. We know the Western Ghats, despite literally centuries of devastation under colonial and post-colonial forestry practices, still's got a lot of trees. It's thick landscape. It's steep, and it feels primal in a certain sense. There are still tigers out there. The biodiversity is riot. It is a fecund environment, and so you see an enormous amount of floral diversity, and you're bound to stumble across a lot of wildlife, birds, amphibians, and then, of course, lots of important mammals, species of conservation concern. That whole belt of protected areas that runs down the length of the Ghats is mostly focused on charismatic megafauna like tigers and elephants, but there's a lot of other stuff out there, an enormous amount. It's a fount of diversity, as I'll mention. So we're wandering through the forest, we're seeing all these things, and then when we get down and we really look around, what is the main plant that we're seeing in this landscape? And the answer, of course, is, what is this? That's coffee, actually. It's coffee. I would have said cacao, too. I'm new to coffee. I worked in Rajasthan for a long time. They don't grow anything there. So this is coffee, both Arabica and Robusta coffee, rubber plantations. You're in the middle, in other words, of an entirely domesticated, artificial, human-produced environment. These are fully owned. These are not protected areas. There's tens of thousands of square kilometers of plantations that are a riot of biodiversity, although with high levels of variability between areas where you see a lot of floral and faunal diversity and areas where you don't. And it's really never, to a great degree, it's never been studied. And it's a counterintuitive because most of our effort, when we think about conservation, focuses on things like the main protected areas, getting a boundary around a polygon to protect important species. And for some species, that is mission critical, because tigers and elephants don't do very well around large populations of people. But for most of the critters and wildlife and plants of India do extremely well around high densities of populations, even in entirely manufactured artificial environments that are tied intimately to the circulation of global commodities in an international capitalist system. So the question is, what kind of conservation do you do in places that are fully humanized, or at least partly humanized? And it's not an idle question. All around the world, you can see the number of protected areas between 82 and 2003. I need to update these numbers. Something like triple. This is the number of protected areas. If you take a look, this is the total coverage of protected areas. You do not have to be a quantitative social or biological or natural scientist to do a little bit of ratio math here, and what you'll see is every year protected areas are getting smaller. And that's because the additional protected areas that are coming on board are those that used to be village lands or forests. They used to be mining quarries and pits. In other words, they are already human-influenced or heavily or human-created environments. And that's a global question then. It's not just a problem for India. But India is the perfect laboratory for where fully humanized and domesticated landscapes and wild things interact constantly. So this is India's lesson, in a certain sense, for the world. So the research that we're undertaking now, sponsored by the National Science Foundation, is to ask what kinds of agroforestry production, that is coffee, various forms of coffee, rubber, arecanut, other kinds of cash crop commodities down here in the southern part of the country, which ones are most amenable to conservation? That is the production of wildlife. Not the conservation of wildlife, but literally its production. And that question has three answers, which brings us to the workers' rights problem. Which crops and systems of production are most conducive to wildlife habitat? Which means if you go around in rubber, various kinds of ways to plant rubber, where do you find wildlife? It's a very simple empirical question. You got to count frogs, you got to count birds. The second question is, what are the configuration of factors that influence the producer's decision that maintains that wildlife? In other words, these plantation owners, though they're sweethearts, are not in it for the frogs, right? They're in it to turn a rupee. This is entirely profit-driven commodity production. So why, in God's name, would these people create landscapes that foster biodiversity? And under what conditions are those decisions fostered? In other words, why do they make the decisions they do? So that's not about counting frogs. That's about talking to thousands of plantation owners about the structure of their household microeconomics. And the third question then is, what are the social, political, institutional contexts that tend to influence the producers to make the decisions that wind up with the habitat that produce the wildlife? In other words, how does the regional political economy, and under what conditions, give us frogs? I'm going to give you the answer to these three questions right up front. One, which crops and systems of production are more conducive? Seems like more extensive, highly complex coffee and some rubber does a lot better than, for example, arecanut or intensified coffee production. And we'll see that. But even with that variability, we're seeing a lot of wildlife. I'm going to show you wildlife. Second, what are the configuration of factors that influence producer decisions? We had assumed that would mostly be farm gate prices. That is, when coffee prices go down, which they do all the time, we would think people would shift out of coffee into something else. So the main pressure, in other words, would be like the global price of stuff. When the price of stuff changes, habitat changes. And the punchline to this story is that we were wrong. That when we talk to all of these owners, the real thing that configures their decision is the cost of rural labor. And the rural labor bargain in India, as it is in China, as it is throughout Latin America, is fundamentally changing with urbanization, migration. The rural Indian countryside is in a state of quiet revolution. And the labor bargain has tipped in favor of laborers asking for things that they never had the power to ask for before, like television and refrigerators. And that has enormous implications for the people who own these plantations because, again, nice as these guys are, and they're guys almost to a man, their biggest complaint is uppity workers, and that shouldn't be surprising to anybody who spent time in rural India. But they don't get their way all the time. And that, I think, is the larger implication for those of you who are not interested in amphibians, is that the rural labor bargain has changed in India, and the future of India depends on how these things get sorted out, it seems to me. Quicker in the south than in the north, but eventually everywhere and forever. And third, what are the political conditions and contexts that then influence that relationship, specifically to crops and to labor? We don't have an answer to that. We think cooperatives has a great deal to do with what is influencing these things, but this is kind of the last part of the study, which we haven't gotten to. I'm not alone in this work. I'm working with both Ashwini Chaudhary at the University of Illinois, and this could not have happened without Kriti Karant at the Center for Wildlife Science in Bangalore. Not only because I had never even been to, I've worked in India since 1990, and I never set foot in Karnataka until 2 years ago. So without a real interdisciplinary team and a lot of local field work, none of this work could be accomplished. So some of the context richness, which I think you deserve, you will not receive in this talk, but you will see some cool pictures of frogs. Where are the Western Ghats? Just we know that they run down here along the tail end here of Maharashtra, down through Karnataka, and then here on the border with Kerala and Tamil Nadu. The area of our specific concern is an area where the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Center for Wildlife Studies have worked for a really long time. It's right in these borderlands where protected areas have been popping up like mushrooms after, well, that's unfair. There's a huge amount of labor in getting a protected area to be gazetted. And this Wildlife Conservation Society has spent 120 years, basically. They run the New York Zoo, getting these protected areas into the landscape. But this also is the area where all this coffee, arecanut, and rubber is grown. So it's an interesting site location. You can see it's pretty rugged. You'll see what the field teams have to do to get the data that we have, and there's talk about underpaid labor. That's like why graduate students exist. Why? It's not funny. I know it's not funny, and I apologize. But that's how it works. So postdocs are even better. So the natural vegetation down here, for those of you who have not been down here, I can't believe I've never been here, evergreen, moist deciduous, dry deciduous forests, montane grasslands. It's really highly variable. You'll see these grasslands up on the hills, and then suddenly shocks of dense forest, and then you'll see a coffee plantation. That sculpted mosaic has everything to do with settlement history in the region, which goes way, way back to the pre-colonial period. But this region contains 30% of all Indian plant and vertebrate species. The Western Ghats alone has a third of the species. So if you're going to worry about this stuff anywhere, this is a good place to worry about it. In terms of the land uses I'm talking about, I'll give you some numbers in a minute. Compared to formal conservation areas, which only cover about 12% of less than 12% of the landscape, or some of my favorite romantic sacred groves, which probably cover, the kind of Gadgil Guha notion of conservation is it's all going to be sacred groves, probably less than 1% of the landscape. Compared to those land uses, it's coffee plantations. Why rob banks? That's where the money is. If you're interested in conservation, you're going to have to deal with large landowners. The diversity of the region is just staggering. We didn't work on things like arachnids or ants or do any of that kind of work that many people do in conservation, but you could spend a lifetime studying 2 or 3 spider species in this region. It's a remarkable place. You do get some sense there's a large mega mammal population, sambar deer and the like, and fighting peacocks. So this is male behavior. These guys were so exhausted when they were done. Imagine trying to drag all that plumage around into a dogfight. Anyway, there they are again. Leaving those guys aside, it's also one of the main sources of water for the region. What you'll see is because of the rain-shadow effect, all of the water movement will go from the Ghats and the Western Ghats into places like Bangalore over the next 10 or 15 years. We're talking about massive diversions of water, massive infrastructure, dams. There's going to be a real transformation of these landscapes. So we're interested in trying to conserve things. All right, so what are these commodities? Coffee covers about 3,200 square kilometers in the study area. Rubber over 5,000 square kilometers, and areca is about 2,700 square kilometers. That's a lot. That's more land than there'll ever be in protected areas, I can tell you. 10,000 square kilometers of productive, economically rich spaces where armies of workers are employed, filled with biodiversity. The commodity production system also manifests enormous amounts of variation. We talked to plantation owners who own more than 100 hectares and ones smaller than 10, actually some smaller than 5. People can own there's still a lot of smallholders in the Indian countryside, and that shouldn't be surprising, but even in major commercial commodities. So, what do these commodities look like? This is what coffee looks like in the Ghats up here. Let's start with that one. You'll notice that the coffee is this little shrubby, greeny stuff on the ground. These trees are silver oak that are intercropped. It's an agroforestry system. The reason you have these trees is, one, they provide shade, which is good for certain kinds of coffee, okay? The other reason is coffee tends to be incredibly volatile. So prices will be way up for a couple of years, and then they'll be in the toilet. So when Vietnam came into coffee production when would that have been? Any coffee wallas out there?
1890.
Yeah, the global prices just plummeted, and people were starving in Oaxaca, Mexico, owing to transformations in mid-90s. That sounds about right. But for somebody growing shade-grown coffee, you have a lot more diversity for livelihoods. So these trees, this is silver oak. It's an exotic. It's not an invasive exotic. Introduced to India many, many years ago, but it's a really good way to stabilize your production system. So even when coffee is low, you can harvest trees. So the diversity that you're seeing here is both biodiversity and therefore also economic diversity, which keeps people on the land. That's what coffee looks like. This is areca, an increasingly controversial crop. It's a palm crop. We all know it from betel nut. The controversy stems from its possible carcinogenic nature. It's going to go under heavier regulation probably in India over the next 10 years, which has worried a lot of these producers who may be getting out of the areca business. And then finally, rubber. Rubber is tapped actually in a fairly traditional way, and I'll show it to you in a moment. And you can just look at these landscapes and take a guess about what's going to produce the most biodiversity. Any guesses?
Coffee.
Coffee definitely does best. And we really thought that rubber was going to be a desert, and I can actually tell you that it performs almost as well for certain assemblages of species as coffee. Areca turns out to be the big desert, which I think is interesting. Again, this is coffee production. It can vary a lot, as you can see, from a more open to a more closed canopy. There are two kinds of coffee. This is not trivial. Arabica coffee is the expensive stuff, or historically expensive stuff. It prefers the shade. It's fussier. It's more expensive to grow. It takes a lot more hand labor, which is important to our story. And it tends to be, as we'll see, more biologically productive. Robusta coffee is the cheap stuff that goes into instant coffee, historically much cheaper, and therefore wasn't a favored crop by a lot of these producers. But as we'll see, the price changes have driven people out of one kind of coffee into another. As I said, a lot of variability. This is really shady. Nothing's that shady. This is the only plantation I've seen that looks like that. Again, rubber with this ground cover here, and you see it's tapped by hand, which you're shaving off. Has anybody seen rubber production in action? What you're doing is you're shaving at an angle here right near the surface, so the sap is running down into these cups. These are collected every day, panned, flattened, cooked, and then sold on regional markets. There's a lot of money in rubber. As it turns out, it's pretty easy to grow. This gives you a sense. I'm amazed at the biodiversity that actually we found here. You can see a lot of this is still pretty laborious and traditionally managed kinds of commodities. And then areca, sort of more intensive, but as I'll show you from the labor scheme, harvesting arecanut is a huge pain in the butt. You actually got to climb up the top of the palm to cut it down, right? And the workers will stay up there all day without coming down. They'll just swing from, it's highly skilled labor and it's expensive, swing from palm to palm. And here's sort of the last legs of traditional areca cooking here before it reaches the market. A lot of this stuff is being industrialized and intensified in urban environments. A lot of this is moving off farm. Historically, this would have all happened right on the farmstead. You'd cook these arecanuts and shuck them and then process and sell them along. So don't worry about that. This gives you some sense of where our actual hypotheses, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. We actually have to measure diversity. We actually have to count the species and then ask ourselves, where do we see, just variably, where do we see the most of it? What kinds of trees are associated with it? What kinds of cropping strategies? What decisions are farmers making? And then we're asking ourselves, what makes the farmers make those decisions again? And that's the capitalized context of their farm operation. And again, this labor, you'll see, does not appear. This comes right out of my grant proposal to the National Science Foundation, where we did not mention labor because we are, that's right, fat middle-class people. Any farmer could have redrawn this diagram better than the ones we did. Labor would have jumped right out at them, and it didn't until we were in the field. So let that be a lesson. What do we do when we're counting birds? Does anybody care about the birds? Yeah, sure you do. It's a lot of work, and here we have volunteers who have to be vetted, and then a series of postdocs running teams out in the landscape. You have to find between 4 and 9 points. These are spaced then about 200 meters apart. So there's sort of laborious slugging around in these coffee landscapes, and these will be visited morning and evening, 3 days in a row for several minutes, where you're listening for bird call. You don't see birds, right? The people who collect these data collect it by recognizing birds by call, which is a very specialized skill, and fewer rural Indians possess this skill. So the people that we're looking for are an increasingly rare commodity themselves. So we've got 6 interns, 11 volunteers, and the volunteers have to take this test where they identify bird call. It's a nightmare because people come in, everybody wants to be a part of this. I mean, there are all these well-meaning middle-class guys who come in from Bangalore and they're like, I know all about birds. You know, I grew up within several miles of a coffee plantation. I can name 50 species, and you show them these pictures and they're as befuddled as I am. So it takes months just to recruit the field team. These guys, the people you're looking at here, are really, really great. It's a lot of work. And at each of the sites, when you're actually collecting these data, you're also getting as much ancillary data as you can. Like, what's the structure of the flora that might account for that kind of biodiversity, okay? And what do you see when you're out there? These are the cruddy pictures. You can tell they're cruddy. You can tell who took these. These are all me. But you do see a lot of avian diversity. These much better photos are taken by other people. And you get some really terrific, there's some common, like the racquet-tailed drongo is pretty common. So are some of the woodpeckers, but there's some extremely rare and critically threatened, according to the IUCN, species. And they're not living out in some nature preserve, right? They are living in an industrial site, right? This is, of course, common. The hill myna It's so annoying. I like the Malabar bar, but I'm not going to go into this. But the questions that the biologists are interested in when they see these diversities is coffee producing the same kind of diversity that you might get in a national park? Or is it producing a whole nother kind of diversity? Are there things you don't find in national parks that you do find in coffee, for example, because of a particular suite of habitat? This is not my area. I'm not a biologist. But that's some of the analysis that you put these kinds of data to. And the other part, this is much, so that's the easy part, is counting birds. Counting amphibians, because there's a standardized method. Counting amphibians, apparently nobody has ever figured out a good way to do it. So the approach is having these quadrats. They're looked at about 2 or 3 times by different folks. You poke around. It's the middle of the night, and it's the rainy season, and it's Karnataka. It's the Ghats. This is crazy work. Too old for that. And they photograph everything they find, they type it, but most of the diversity that they're going to spot is not going to be visual. It's going to be audible. They know the croaks of different frogs, which is really quite remarkable. So you can see the spread of our sites up and down the Ghats. We looked at about 80 or 100 sites for biodiversity, and then we interviewed 1,000 plus plantation owners, and Vaishnavi gets to look at those data later this semester. Good luck with that. So just a quick question around the amphibians. How many species are we looking at here? 2? It's 1. It's all 1 species. So they can be tricky, and that's why you've got to be able to recognize them kind of audibly. Right, because I don't know, it looks like 6 to me, you know? And what are we finding? I want to end the pretty pictures of the animals and get onto the workers' story in just a moment. But what we're finding is a treasure trove. We're talking about species, some of which are critically endangered. That is the last stop on the train before extinction. We are seeing species that were only discovered or new to science in 2008. We are seeing species that were thought to have disappeared or gone extinct in India because they couldn't be found where? In protected areas. And there they are out in the rural landscape with people, which I think is really, that alone, without any statistics or weird biometrics and econometrics, without any of that story, I think is the one that will always stick with me, is that we're finding things, because it's the old story, right, about the drunk looking for his keys under the light pole. We know this one? Well, that's the story. And when it comes to biodiversity, that's where people have looked. Conservation biologists are all about parks, bless their hearts. And as a result, all their research takes place in parks. And by moving research out of parks into places like this or urban areas, there's a lot of good urban ecology beginning to come up in at least in South India, we're going to find things that we didn't know we had, which it's a good news story. It's even a good news story for the workers. Okay, so this guy, smallest frog in India, that guy's great. How do you even spot that? Looks like a rock to me. This was only rediscovered in the year 2000, and it's extremely localized, but we're seeing hundreds of these in ponds associated with coffee cultivation. And then this guy is critically threatened, critically endangered, actually, that's incorrect, critically endangered. So this is like a prize. This is a prize for that team. Lots of frogs, okay. And it isn't just because there aren't snakes. So if you were a biologist, the first thing you'd say is, well, of course you got a lot of frogs in coffee because you killed all the snakes. Now you can't have frogs without snakes. Snakes just love frogs. And not in like a frog and toad are friends way, in an eating way. These were all taken by the field team. This is also why I don't do this work. So that's the first part. We're finding diversity. Then we talk to 1,000 farmers and we ask them what they're doing on their properties and why they're doing it. And one of the first things we're learning is that they're going in and out of coffee. So a lot of people are moving out of Areca cultivation and into coffee. Now, if it's true that coffee, even Robusta coffee, which tends to be somewhat poor in terms of diversity, has higher biodiversity or different or better, that's very relative, biodiversity than arecanut, then the shift out of arecanut into coffee actually might be a good thing. They don't share the same spot on the landscape, though, in terms of grade, so it may not turn out that way. But many people are also going out of coffee because of the continuing lull in prices ever since the mid-90s and going into rubber. And the main reason here is not because rubber is so valuable, as I'll come back to in a moment, it takes a whole lot less work. You get to hire fewer workers. All right? There are other choices that can be made, though, within a crop. You can leave your canopy really open, or you can leave it closed. And you got to think about somebody, a farmer in the Ghats, pulling on levers. So if I open the canopy, what do I get? A lot more coffee, because all that growth is just solar energy, right? Generating money. It's rupees. They're just falling off of these bushes. But if you open it too much, you begin to get disease, you get pest infestations, you get scorching, and your yields go down. So they're constantly throttling back and forth on the level of the canopy. And where they settle on a canopy really matters for things like birds and frogs. Again, not for reasons entirely extraneous to the success of that diversity. It's entirely about controlling the flow of value from the landscape. And then you can choose varying levels of species diversity. This is a very monocultural coffee plantation where we have almost entirely silver oak, which is, again, an exotic species, actually. I believe it was a colonial introduction. And then this is a much more diverse kind of a canopy where you actually are growing more and different kinds of trees. Now, there are incentives to do one or the other, and we're trying to figure out why people do one or the other, because there seems to be a real difference in strategy between different farming, production, agroforestry systems. And then you can also just mix all kinds of cool stuff in here, which again has implications for biodiversity, but is really about cropping. This, anybody know what this is? Black pepper. That's pepper. And that's a boon. So that's what's nice about agroforestry is that you can yield these ancillary benefits without costing yourself anything, since you've just got the trees in the landscape. So squeezing the last few paisa out of the land actually sometimes benefits biodiversity. Sometimes it doesn't, right? So on to the final part of the study, which is with these 1,000 producers. And I just wanted to point to the incredible variability of the producers we're talking about. These guys are all living within, I'd say, about 100 kilometers of one another. Well, this guy holds a master's in agronomy and another master's in conservation biology, and knows all of these species that he sees. And some of these folks, this gentleman does not have a high school education. He also knows all of the birds, and needless to say, and the frogs out here in the landscape. He's operating on hundreds of hectares. He's operating on less than 5. We want to know whether there's a structure to the difference in their decision making relative to biodiversity production. So they got a lot of different strategies, but they've been doing several things in common, and this is what I want to point to. One, they are shifting out of high-risk crops, which includes coffee, to some degree. That's bad. That's a bad news story for biodiversity. So there's a question about how do you keep, if you're interested in biodiversity, are you willing to pay people to keep coffee on the land? So that's an ecosystem services kind of question. That's one shift that you're seeing. Two, they are all now in the tourism business. It doesn't matter if you have 1,000 square kilometers or you got to patch out back. You now have, almost every place has what's called a guest stay operation. And people come for the weekend, and I can tell you why. It's paradise. Up in the hills. Who do you think is coming?
Middle-class Indians?
Yeah, they're all from Bangalore. They're one generation from rural, sometimes 2 generations from rural areas. And they're mostly very heavily in the tech sector, though not exclusively. A lot of them are in other kinds of construction. I wish I'd invested in construction in Bangalore in 1995. We would be able to fund this entire center forever. A lot of construction owners. So they're making a lot of money on the side. My point about this is that livelihood diversification is a really important part of what makes it possible for them to leave things like coffee on the land. If they were really only depending on coffee, probably there wouldn't be any up there anymore. It's a side or a part of a much more complex strategy. And that's good news. That actually, that diversification is pretty good news. The other thing that they tell us, and this is the coffee issue, is that they're switching heavily out of, if you stay in coffee, you get out of Robusta and into Arabica, and you can see why. As recently as 2011, the price differential for the two was really high. This is sort of the way you traditionally think about it. Arabica coffees are the good ones that get mixed in at Starbucks and all that, and Robusta is instant coffee like they drink in northern India. So that price differential has fallen dramatically. So the price of Robusta coffee's gone down Arabica coffee's gone down while Robusta stayed the same, which reduces the disincentive to be in Robusta, which is much more highly productive and contains far less biodiversity. Again, because you can open up the canopy, basically it'll look like more like a traditional row crop. It looks like industrial farming. Whereas Arabica looks a whole lot more like a complex assemblage of plants, all right? And then the second finding, and this is where I want to kind of dwell for the last few minutes, and maybe people have some who know the rural sector in India better than I do, might have some thoughts on this, but each and every one of them, except the very smallest holders who are able to self-exploit, right? Their labor burden is very, very low since they are themselves doing most of the labor. That's a very small minority. Almost everybody has to hire somebody. And the bigger plantations have to hire armies of people. And in fact, ever since the British really put coffee on the ascendance, they have kept residential sets of laborers on the land in those coffee plantations year-round in conditions that seem now, coming out of Bangalore, is quite archaic. And you can see what they're doing, which is they're voting with their feet. Rural labor is moving out of the countryside. It is arguing for shorter hours. It is taking shorter hours no matter what was contracted. It is coming on its own schedule instead of when the owner of the plantation needs it, which is a very sensitive question for plantation owners. Your harvest windows for some of these crops are extremely small. That's the nice part about rubber, right? You just keep tapping it all the time. Whereas coffee, you need people in the field at a particular time, and you need them in large numbers, and then you need them to get lost. It is an incredibly historically exploitative relationship, and the way the owners, even the poorer owners, talk about the workers is quite uniform. Back in my father's generation, people knew how to work. These are shiftless, lazy, corner cutting. These guys are, this is going to be the end of Indian agriculture because workers are making demands on these coffee owners that no one's ever been able to make before. Modest demands in terms of wage, time, in terms of upgrading for permanent resident workers, upgrading the conditions under which they live, electrifying these huts. A lot of them aren't electrified. These are demands that were literally never made in their fathers' or their grandfathers' generations, which are made quite commonly now. And this is quite remarkable because for Ashwini and I, our guess would have been, and we're not students of labor migration, but our guess would be there's always somebody in Bihar who needs a job. Surely there is some middleman that is going to come along and broker large numbers of people into this landscape. And so now understanding that labor and the rights demands that laborers are making is an important part of our story, we put a postdoc just exclusively on this question. So she is going to talk to all of the people who do the labor contracting. She's going to talk to the owners. She's going to talk to the workers about what's going on. But preliminarily, I would say even with, you never think India would run out of workers. And the truth is, it's never absolute. But in relative terms, I think that this is it's the second most profound part for me of this project. The first being this question about diversity in these human landscapes. The other part is this, that actually, even if you don't run out of a labor force, in a place like Karnataka, that's the specialized labor. If you don't get this guy, you don't harvest, right? The Karnataka fertility rate is now 1.79. So we're below the replacement rate. Just the Kerala miracle that everybody's talked about since 1975 or 80 as this outrageous exception in the Indian fertility landscape has been overtaken and mimicked all across India, except Rajasthan. But the fertility rate's fallen, and it has to do with a massive urbanization of the population and a GDP growth per capita, total 8.6% between 2005 and 2010. That's an annual GDP growth. That's incredible. In India, I know everyone's really jealous of the China miracle. But the incredible thing that's going on here is a lot of investment. There's a lot of capital moving through this system. And with this kind of growth, you don't need to run out of workers to have laborers begin to make demands in terms of wage and hour rates that are different. And that's what's happening. The Indian economic miracle, for all of its problems, the fact that it's faltering, that it's grossly uneven, it's outrageously exploitative in its own self, it's a kind of neoliberal disaster, yada, yada, yada. I'm a Marxist. What I've learned is that it has some interesting spillover benefits when it comes to the way workers can approach power relative to the rest of the rural landscape. And this is only going to keep going, right? It's not like everybody's going to move back into the countryside and become coffee pickers. Whatever happens, most of the people that we're talking to in the labor force go to Bangalore, but they don't want to be there. They don't want to be there because it's more expensive than being in the rural areas. The wage rate's not that much better. but you can get television and the quality of life and medical care that has been denied people, particularly on these large plantations, for long periods of time. So I actually think that this is the thing to think about a little bit, is what is the future of rural India? Now, I don't want to paint a picture where there's nobody in the rural areas anymore. If you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation just on the global population, let's say we get to about 11 billion, that's before we stop growing sometime in the mid-late century, and we get to something like 75% urbanization. Those are both pretty reasonable back-of-the-envelope calculations. If you actually do the math on that, that means there'll be as many people in rural areas then as there are now, in absolute numbers. So it's not like workers in the rural areas are going away, and it's not like everybody here is going to be in the tech sector. So it's really going to be about bargains made at the household level, at the plantation level, and then within, of course, rural development planning in these areas over what acceptable labor conditions are. And that will determine the degree to which we have biodiversity. The caveat to the punchline, before I stop, is that one of the reasons we have biodiversity is because there's historically been labor exploitation. So when workers leave the land and become more expensive, you tend to replace them with pesticides, intensification, and other kinds of logical, microeconomic, agricultural decisions which are not good for frogs. Now, one of the things about political ecology, whether you're of the Marxian bent or the romantic Vandana Shiva bent, whatever it is, whatever tradition you come from, Gadgil or other, including me, you always associate biodiversity with the thriving of rural poor people, that those two things go with one another. And I want to suggest that that relationship is much more complicated. That in fact, keeping biodiversity on the land while workers are making what are perfectly reasonable demands may actually require a lot more intervention and cleverness than simply hoping to set aside some village land for some cattle. This is about a really complicated global economy and a very, very complicated micro-biodiversity landscape. But it's one to which we could now pay attention if we turn our vision away from protected areas and ask how we can encourage a new labor bargain to also be one that's good for wildlife. That's all I have to say. Thank you.